Hey everybody, this is Jeff Besson with Intuiface. Thank you so much for attending this webinar. Today I'd like to talk to you about Intuiface Analytics. Analytics is probably one of the greatest advantages delivered by interactive content, because interactive content is just richly dressed with information that you can use to build business insight, to learn about your audience, to get a better handle on the effectiveness of your deployment. Interactivity is just the best starting point for collecting the information you can use to make informed business decisions. It's the key to analytics. And this is my opportunity to educate you about how one does analytics with Intuiface, both from the perspective of using interactivity to generate information and then building the charts and dashboards you'll use to visualize that data and ultimately to gain the insight and make the decisions that will help you improve the effectiveness of your projects. The way we'll go about doing this is I'll start with a quick introduction to Intuiface Analytics. We'll talk a little bit about the notion of connectors, which enable you to predetermine how you'll be using the collected data to perform your analysis. Then I'll walk through the way you add the data tracking mechanism, the data collection mechanism into your experience. I will demonstrate how to then collect that data and ultimately visualize it using charts, and then wrap it up with a quick look at the way we price it so you can understand the expenses you'll have as a result of adopting this aspect of Intuiface. A lot of it's sort of a behind-the-scenes look and a demonstration. Hopefully you'll find this interesting. I want to begin with an overview. So let's start with a quick overview. On the left of this diagram are all of your players, all of the experiences running all over the world. They're running your work, yes? And each player is running an experience that is configured to collect data. As I said, I'll show you how to do that in a moment. But let's take for granted in this graphic that each individual player represented on the left is individually collecting data because they're individually running your experiences, and you configured those experiences to collect data. So they're all collecting data independently and independently uploading that data into what we call the data hub. Each player is collecting its own independent data set and pushing it to this cloud-based repository we call the Intuiface Data Hub. Under the covers, it's Amazon S3. It's not our server, it's Amazon. So very scalable, reliable, always available in the cloud. So all the data is there. And the reason we do that is it enables us to collate all this disparate data coming from all these disparate players, package it up in one place, and make it ready for analysis. Then as we move to the right third of this diagram, you'll note you have two choices. You can analyze the data directly using Intuiface charts and dashboards, or you can forward it to a third-party platform and do the analysis there. So that's up to you. That's a decision you'll need to make. I would say the majority of our customers are using Intuiface charts and dashboards because they don't have any skill set, any history, and any tools to use to do analytics. This is pretty typical. Most of us don't come from a world where a lot of analytics was performed. We just don't have a background in it, and we don't have the infrastructure to perform it. And so Intuiface charts and dashboards does the job. But some of you come from a world where you have this experience. You might be a subject matter expert. Lots of export options, which we'll talk about as well. So that's analytics big picture. We're now going to get a little closer. Okay, we're diving in a little closer to what we mean by Intuiface Analytics. Let's start with the notion of automatic event capture. So at the end of the day, anytime you want to collect data, you need to specify the event that will trigger the data collection, okay? There's an event, could be a touch, could be a navigation, could be some external trigger, but some event triggers the collection of data. Certain events are automatic. You don't have to tell us to collect data, we'll collect it for you. Now, by and large, we don't automatically collect data because we don't want to bury you in useless information, right? So for the most part, you specify the relevant events and you specify the relevant data to collect because that's the data you need to build the charts, to build the visualizations you require to make business decisions. However, there are some events where we automatically capture data. So for example, the time when the experience starts and stops, and the time of when scenes are entered and exited. And the reason we do that is you get duration. You know how long an experience was running. You know how long people dwelled in a scene. Any of you coming from retail, for example, if you've ever worked with signage, interactive kiosks and retail, you know that dwell time is a very important statistic because what you're identifying is how long people stand at that screen and use it. So dwell time is important, and we will automatically collect the overall usage for the experience and then the dwell time per scene. And that's done on a multi-user basis. I'll explain that, but we're doing that for every single user at the kiosk. There's also some information we collect automatically. The name of the device running player, the name of your experience, timestamps for each individual collected data point. There's a lot of information that you'll typically use to filter and to sort the data. You don't have to tell us to collect it. We're always going to collect it. And that applies even to the events you specify. So it's not just the automatic events, but it's the ones you specify as well. For all of them, there are certain pieces of information we always collect because we know you're going to use it for filtering and sorting. Another point is that when the event occurs and you want to collect data, you can collect any amount of data you wish, or as we say here, unlimited data point parameters. So for example, if it's a retail scenario, and you can see that in the graphic here, sure, because it's interactive, you know somebody picked a shirt. You know that, right? Because they tapped it. But what you can do from a data point perspective is not just identify that a shirt was tapped, but you can pull in information that specifies which shirt, right? The product type, the color, the price, the size. These can be pulled depending on how you've configured your experience. This data is available. It's accessible through the back office, and we have ways of getting our hands on that information. All of that data can be in a data point parameter. So you don't just know that the screen was tapped or that a shirt was tapped. You can know a lot about that tap. And I'm going to return to this notion again in a little bit because context is huge. Not only can you collect information about the event itself, but the context around the event, you're going to want that. And I'll explain that. I'm going to leave you on pins and needles, and we'll get back to context. It might be assumed that you have to be online to use Intuiface Analytics, and it's not true. You don't have to be online. Player can collect data no problem, even if it's offline. Certainly at some point it needs to be online because that's how the data will go from the player to the Intuiface data hub. So at some point you need an internet connection, but it doesn't need to be 24/7, 365. Player is perfectly happy storing all this data locally and waiting for the network connectivity to return. So the only limitation you really have is disk space. You know, I imagine eventually, I'm using disk space in quotes because you can use Intuiface Analytics on any platform we support, even if it doesn't have a spinning platter. But you get the idea. As long as there's some memory available on the device, we can collect data offline, and then when the device is online, we'll push it to the data hub. Session management. Let me spend a moment on this because it's important. Some of you may be familiar with web analytics because that's been around for a long time. It's very closely related to Google's main source of revenue, which is advertising. Monetizing people's ad impressions and clicks and this sort of thing. One of the nice things about web analytics is every time somebody visits a website, it's a very discrete event. The web server knows it's a new person because it knows it's a new device, because it knows the address of that device. Maybe you didn't realize that, but every time you use your web browser to visit a website, that website knows your address, unless you do some obfuscation. But typically, it knows your address, and it can differentiate thus one user from another, and by the way, recognize returning users, either through cookies or maybe even through the IP address. So between the IP address and the cookies, it's very easy for websites to differentiate one visitor from another, to follow their visit from one web page to the other and know that this particular path was visitor A, that particular path was visitor B. Between that and cookies, it can really learn a lot. And of course, that's important because if you cannot differentiate visitors, you just have a mess of link clicks, and you cannot figure out if particular paths are more popular or when certain pages are visited is in the context of other visits. It's important. And broadly speaking, that's called session management. Each visitor has its own session. His or her visit is a session. Every time they come back after a period of time, it's a new session. Ideally, you want to do this with Intuiface as well. You want to differentiate sessions. The problem, of course, is people's fingers don't have an IP address, right? They don't carry cookies. Well, they might carry cookies, but they're reading them. They're not feeding them to the kiosk, right? So it's important to differentiate sessions, to differentiate users, so you can individually identify paths and popularity based on use, and then maybe contextually time of day and other things. But how do you do it, right? So there is a mechanism in Intuiface to say a new session has started, a new session has stopped. You can do that with analytics. Session has started, session has stopped, you can give it a name. The trick is just to know when to understand, to recognize that a session has started or stopped, and that comes down to your design. So it's a little out of scope of this webinar, but let me just briefly touch on that notion that if managing sessions are important, and if we let you identify when sessions begin and end, it's important for you to conceptualize an experience that gives you some indication that a new session has started or the existing session has ended. So for example, if you have a button that says start, or whatever, well, that's a pretty good indication that a new session has started, right? If there's an end button, you know it's ended. If you have an inactivity timer that resets the experience, it's a pretty good bet that no matter what happens next, it's a new person, it's a new session. You see what I mean? So is this going to be 100% accurate? No, there might be some edge cases where your system thinks it's a new session, but it's really the same user who clicks start, end, and start again, right? It could happen. But 80-20, 90-10, by and large, you're going to successfully differentiate one session from another. It's in your interest to do so, and Intuiface enables you to do that. The data itself that we transfer to the data hub is compressed. It's really small. And I point this out because most of you might be on a very fat Ethernet connection. It's no big deal. You don't have to worry about data. But some of you might be working over a 3G, 4G, 5G connection. It's a metered environment where data usage is something you pay for. Rest assured, we crunch it as much as we can to take up as little space as possible. Finally, this sort of closer view of the data collection piece. I mentioned it before. Don't underestimate this. It's everywhere Intuiface runs. You can collect data for analytics. The beauty is that the feature itself, you don't have to know anything about these platforms. You don't do anything different for these platforms. Intuiface Analytics works the same. It acts the same. You configure it the same everywhere. Isn't that nice? So it's all just sort of built in, nothing to worry about. All right, let's get a little bit closer again. Now we're talking about the data itself. What kind of data can you collect? Okay. At a high level, I like to look at it in sort of three different slices. First, there's the interaction event. That's the video was watched, the book was read, this scene was visited, the image was rotated. Somebody did something physically. It's usually physically, although these days it could be voice activated and otherwise, which you can do with Intuiface, by the way. But there's some human act that resulted in some kind of interaction, and that event can be recognized by Intuiface, and you can record the fact that that event occurred, right? I hope that's obvious, right? It's one of the core things of Intuiface is that you can recognize that. So that's pretty clear. That's typical, right? But there's other kinds of information you can know with Intuiface that is important to help you make informed decisions based on that data. One of them is who that person is. There's lots of ways to get this information. Maybe they have a badge and they scanned it. Maybe there's a form and they filled it out. Maybe you're using computer vision to identify gender. So by user identification, I don't mean, name and serial number and, social security and credit card. It just something about them that differentiates them from others. In a retail world, knowing gender and age might be enough, right? You don't know who they are, and you don't know if they're happy parents or grandparents. You don't know this stuff. But you do know is a 50-year-old female. And if you get enough 50-year-old females, you can start reaching some opinions about what typically 50-year-old females wish to do on this particular kiosk, right? So there are lots of ways to gather this information, something you might want to consider for your deployment. Can you get this kind of information? Because you can certainly collect it. And when I demonstrate the feature in action, you'll see how to do that. Another type of data you can collect, so there's the interaction event, there's user identification, there's also the environment. And we can define that broadly. Certainly there's the building, the weather outside, the city, right? These are environments. We can define this as broadly as we want. We could say the environment includes the score of the Red Sox baseball game down the street, or the movie playing in the movie theater right now. All of this environmental location information gives you additional context to the interaction. So not only do you know that it was a 50-year-old female who looked at this dress, you knew what happened on a rainy day. And you might discover over time that in general, 50-year-old women only look at their dress on rainy days. That's interesting. We should look into that, right? That sounds kind of actionable in a variety of ways. It implies that maybe in rainy days we should highlight that dress, and in sunny days we should hide it. Maybe it means that we should run promotions on rainy days for this dress, or you get the idea. So collecting this context, as I mentioned, is huge because it gives you greater insight into the meaning of the data you're collecting. A lot of this data would be part of custom events. That's when you're typically using custom events. Remember, we talked about the automatically collected event information and the custom events. Usually they're going to be custom events with custom data. On occasion, it's going to be those automatic events. But when you're collecting all these interactive information and user information and location and environmental, all of that stuff is part of custom events, which, remember, as many parameters as you want. And every data point can be different, by the way. It could be 1, there could be 10, as many as you want. All right, we're getting a little bit closer now to the demonstration. In fact, there's one other thing I want to discuss before we look at the feature in action, which is the notion of a connector. So let me go to the My Intuiface website. And we don't need to see go to webinar there. So here I am on the My Intuiface website, which all of you have access to if you have an Intuiface account. And in the middle column here, middle section, is something called Analytics Data. So I'm going to Analytics Data. There's a dashboard up top, and there's connectors at the bottom. I'll go back to the dashboard in a moment. Let's look at the connectors. The reason I'm pointing these out now is because some of the connectors need to be configured before you collect data. So let me explain what a connector is, and then we'll talk about configuring them. If you are not going to use Intuiface charts and dashboards, then that means you're going to be forwarding the data to something else. Okay? Here are the different ways you can access our data outside of Intuiface charts and dashboards. First is Excel. You can export the collected data into an Excel spreadsheet. You can do a little bit of filtering before you download the data points. Okay? So that is Excel, pretty straightforward, and there's nothing to pre-configure, right? There's no pre-configure here. Just download the data points when I want. Turns out in this time range there are no data points, so there's 0 records found. So I might need to change the date range, but it's not a pre-configure. I can do this after the data is collected. You can work with Google Analytics. So believe it or not, maybe you weren't aware of this, but about 3 years ago now, 2-3 years ago, Google realized that conceptually what they're doing for websites was equally applicable to mobile applications. So the way they positioned it was you can track interactions in mobile apps the same way you can track interactions with websites. Well, whether your Intuiface experience is mobile or not, we can think of them as applications in the field, and you can apply Google Analytics to your collected data. You can do that. When you use Google Analytics, you need to specify which property you'll be forwarding the data to. Google Analytics, I think, in my word, it's a project. I think that's conceptually what it is, but they don't call it a project. They call it a property. So you need to specify the name and tracking ID for that property. So that's something you're doing in Google Analytics. It's not us. So in Google Analytics, you create a property, you define the name, you get the tracking ID, you specify it here. You can have multiple Google Analytics properties, and you can forward data to more than one and turn it on and turn it off. And so you can do that, but you need to do this proactively. You need to do this in advance. The same thing goes for Mixpanel. You need to specify a name, and they call it a token for a particular project. You can see I have one project here where I'm collecting data. I could add other ones. I need to do this proactively. Same thing for segment. Now here's the thing. Google Analytics help you analyze the data. Mixpanel is a very mainstream and successful data analysis tool. That's what they do for a living. You can forward your data to Mixpanel. Segment is a middleman for over 200, I think. Data analysis, marketing automation, data warehousing platforms, just tons of platforms where Segment takes data and forwards it to somebody else. In fact, you can forward data from Segment to Mixpanel. We just happen to go out of our way for Mixpanel. So that's what Segment is. And as implied by the others, you need to specify which Segment project or projects you want this data to go to. Google Analytics calls it a tracking ID. Mixpanel calls it a token. Segment calls it a write key. Conceptually, they're all the same thing. They're identifying the particular entity, the project, the property, whatever, that you want to forward the data to. And as before, you can have multiple, in this case, Segment projects, all getting data at the same time. That's up to you. So if you want to use Google Analytics, Mixpanel, or Segment, you need to pre-configure the connector. The same thing goes for this database reference. You can use your own database. We can forward data to your database. We're essentially going to create the interface to your database. You can push data to it. There's nothing to show here. I don't have a connection. That needs to be pre-configured as well. One last example is this notion of REST APIs. In this case, the idea is it's a pull. So in all these other instances, all these other connectors, it's a push. You're pushing your data to something. Some pieces of software, particularly in the analytics world, are also able to pull information. And when they're pulling information, they are using this REST-based URL with an API key. The API key identifies which project. In this case, which Intuiface project you're pulling data from. Okay, so this is a pull. Because it's a pull, it does not need to be pre-configured. Every project has a key anyway, so you don't have to worry about pre-configuring the key. All Intuiface projects have keys, and you can pull it. So those are the connectors in my experience, and as we mentioned, some need to be pre-configured before data is collected. Let me just briefly then jump to the top to show you that on this, remember this is called the Analytics Data Panel, right? At the top, it does show my consumption of data points. Depending on whether you're free or not, that will restrict the number of data points you can collect, and you're able to track that here. Okay, so this is saying I've used 268 data points out of 4 million, so I am in no danger of using it all up. One point of distinction, notice we have a special line here that says the play mode is processed 1,107 data points. When you're using Composer, you can test the analytics feature for free. In Composer's play mode, you can generate 1 million data points if you want. Have fun and have at it. If you want to generate data points using Player, now we're talking about plans where you purchase an analytics plan based on the number of players, and that will enable you to collect data points. If you don't have paid players and paid Composer, then you cannot collect data with Player, but you can with Composer while it's playing in play mode. Okay, so let's presume I'm not using something that I need to pre-configure. It's good enough for me to use either Excel or, as I'll show you in some depth, Intuiface charts and dashboards, right? So, okay, let's actually start collecting some data. So I have escaped from play mode. Here I am in Composer, and I'm going to collect a little bit of data that we can then analyze. So the scenario is it's a museum exhibition. There's photos. We want to track which photos generate the most interest, and we want to collect some information from a guest book. So the first thing I need to do is add what we call the data tracking interface asset. Now, forgive me if you're new to the Intuiface or not overly familiar. I'm going to talk about things like interface assets. It's out of the scope of this webinar to explain the details. I'm going to assume you understand it. But there's the intro webinar, and there's also a working with data webinar that goes into more detail about what interface assets are and how to work with it. But I'm going to assume you get it, so I'm going to add, in particular, I know it's at the top, the data tracking interface asset. Now, here it is. We've just added it. You can see it in my list of interface assets just by adding it to my experience. Just by adding it to my experience, we're going to include when the experience starts and when it stops. You see that right there? That's one of the properties of the data tracking interface asset, and we're going to collect when the experience starts and when it stops, which means we're going to be collecting duration, how long the experience runs. let me turn on scene navigation events. In other words, every time we enter a scene and then leave it, we're also going to measure the dwell time in the scene. So every time we enter a scene and leave it, we're going to be measuring this time. These are going to be data points. In fact, there's 2 data points, scene entered, scene left. Just like its experience started and experience stopped, that's 2 data points. There's a scene entered, scene left, it's 2 data points, and we will automatically determine the duration and thus the dwell time for those scenes and for the experience, okay? All right, so now it's in my experience. What I need to do here is, what I'm going to do is add a button so that I have some indication that there's a new person at the screen, okay? Remember we talked about that in terms of session management? So let's call this start. We'll make this a red button. So, you know, simple button, simple properties. It's a little hard to see. So the text will make white on red. We'll pick a funky font. There we go. That's a funky font. Increase it a little bit. Okay. So the idea is when somebody clicks this button, we're going to navigate to the next scene, which is called Track Interaction Events, and we're going to indicate that a new session has started. Okay. Let me right-click, add a trigger. When this button is pressed and released, then we're going to do 2 things. We need to identify that the session has begun, and then we're going to navigate to the next scene. So first, interface assets, data tracking, start new session. I'm indicating that a new session has started. So when this button is pressed, we're going to record the fact that a new session has started. Now you'll notice on the right that we can add a session ID. If I don't enter a session ID, we're going to automatically create one. Well, I'm not. Intuiface is. It's this long hexadecimal number randomly generated to ensure that no 2 sessions have the same name, so it's easy to differentiate one session from the other. So you don't have to put in your own session ID. I'm not going to put in my own session ID, but I could, okay? But here I'm not. So when the button is pressed, I'm going to start a new session, and we got to navigate, right? Scene to scene navigation. Go to the scene named Track Interaction Events, because that's the job of the button visually, is to help somebody start their museum visit, right? But I needed to identify that a new session has started first. Okay, so when this button is pressed, we'll indicate a new session has started, and we will navigate to the Track Interaction Event scene, which, as you can see, is populated by a bunch of photos. Now I'm going to generate some data in a couple of minutes, and you'll see this. But what's happening here is this is an asset grid. I can swipe left and right. There's more photos than you can see on screen now. And every time I tap an image, that's this thing in the bottom. See this down here? This is going to slide up with information about that image. That's the way this works. And then I can dismiss the artwork, pick another photo, and then it pops up with information in it. This is sort of what it looks like. Now, again, this is not the webinar for explaining, how this all works. In fact, this is built in the webinar about working with data, working with Excel, API Explorer. So there's a whole other webinar about this. But I know, looking on the left, that this tap is what causes information about the selected photo to populate that thing at the bottom of the scene and then slide into view. Okay, I know that's what's going on here. See this? It's actually changing the image and then setting a bunch of text so that you get information about the selected photo. What I'm going to do is add an additional action, and that's to log information about the selection. So I'm adding another action. See that? Let's move this up a little bit. I'm adding another action, which in this case, interface assets, data tracking, log event. Log event is the one you'll use more than anything else from the data tracking interface asset. This is when you're creating a custom event and recording specified parameters. You're going to do this a bunch, right? So I need to give it a name. Now what's happened is I've used this experience a lot, so it remembers, whoops, why am I not able to click that? No, it's disappearing on me, but it remembers all of the event names I've used before. I don't have to use any of these things. I can type anything I want. The fact is, photo scene works for me, so I'm fine with that. Now we need to add parameters, because here's what, if I just close it now, if I don't specify any data, then what happens is every time a photo is selected, we're going to record an event called photo scene, And that's it. We don't know which photo, right? Ideally, the data point created when this event occurs will contain information about the photo. So let's do that. I'm going to add 2 parameters, in fact. The first, again, these are remembered. Okay, so we don't have to use these things, but I will use name, I guess, because that's the name of the photo, I suppose. I could have typed something else, so I need to put the name in there, and also I'm going to put in the price. I think I saw price, so I'll use that pre-selected thing. So every time a photo is selected, we're creating an event named photo scene. It will have 2 parameters, name and price. I have to get the name and price. So I know I can do that through binding. Here's the data feed. So artwork name. So the name will contain the artwork name value, okay? And the price will contain the value of the price property. So again, if you're unfamiliar with this, take my word for it. What we're saying is whatever is selected, don't get hung up on the names you see here. We're saying whatever is selected, get the artwork name and price, stick them into the parameters called name and price, okay? Good, excellent. There is a button here that says sign our guest book. I know it sends us to the capture user information scene. This is a guest book. There's an email address, a comment, and then a send button. What I would like to do is when somebody clicks the send button is to record the address in the comment. Now here's what's interesting is you could argue this is not about analytics. This is just about collecting data. And that's true. The data tracking mechanism itself does not have to be limited to collecting data for analytics. You could just do it to collect data and then save it as an Excel spreadsheet and there you go. So let's do this. When the send button is collected, so here's the send button. See me on the left? Here's the send button. When the send button is selected, right now it goes to the next scene. But I want to record a data point. So new action, data tracking, log event. We're creating a new data point. In this case, the event name is something about the guest book being signed. I've already written that, so there it is, guest book signed. The parameter here is email address and comment, so I need 1 parameter. We can call it email address. That's a pretty good name. Another parameter could be comment. Again, I didn't have to use those. I could type my own. So if you look left, there's an email input text asset, comment input text asset. That's where I get the values from. So here, for email address, let me go to scene structure, email input. Now I need to select the property text. So I'm going to get the email address out of that. Thank you. And for comment, I need to go to the comment input text asset, and click text. Okay. So now we're going to create a data point. The event name is guest book signed. It has 2 parameters, email address and comment. Personal preference, see me up top, right click, move up. Why am I doing this? Because I want my database, I want the data point to always tell me that the events are happening in the scene they occurred in. So I want this log event action to be recognized as occurring in this user information scene. If I had the log event action after next, then the data point would have said the log event, which would have the right data, but that it occurred in the next scene, and that's not right. I want the log event to be given credit for occurring in this scene, then we go to the next scene. Got it. And then the next scene, end a session. What I want to do here is end the session. Remember, we started the session with a button. We now need to end the session. Right click, add a trigger. In this case, scene, when the scene has been entered, then data tracking, stop current session. We're going to assume that every time that scene is reached, the session is over. We're going to stop the session. Good. Guess what? Let's generate some data, shall we? Play. All right. When I tap start, I'm navigating to the next scene, and I'm indicating a session has started. Start. Here's that photo exhibit I mentioned. Remember, if I tap a button, stuff slides into view. Tap, and up comes this information. The sunshine in the field, this price is $6.50. Got it. What I'm going to do And I'm going to select a bunch. It doesn't matter which. The idea is we're generating data. We've got Thailand over here. Let's get some of the, I always like this picture. That's an awesome picture. And we'll do one more and one more. I think that's 7 images, right? Now I'm going to assign our guest book. Let's go to the guest book. Email address. We'll do john@smith.com. Did you build this with Intuiface? It looks awesome. Now remember, when I push send, it's going to create a data point named guestbook signed, 2 parameters, email address, comment should be this stuff, and it navigates me to the next scene when the scene has been entered, end current session. Good. Now, the way Intuiface works is it purges data every few seconds. I'm not sure the exact duration, but it's short, every 10 seconds, every 30 seconds. It's pretty quick. So you never really have to wait more than a minute for data to appear online for analysis or for export. Nevertheless, we'll give it a couple seconds. Let me do that by just reinforcing a point I've made earlier, which is the following. When you are collecting data, there is so much additional information you can collect to give context to that interaction. The notion of interface assets in Intuiface refers to our ability to interface with anything inside or outside the device on which player is running. So any cloud-hosted service can be accessible to Intuiface. You can read from it, you can write to it. So any information available to the device can be a context for your interaction. It could be the weather outside, it could be location information. I just noticed for some reason we're not getting some data here, some images. But anyway, it's good enough for the webinar. We can get location information. If you got computer vision, you can get gender and age and crowd size and all that sort of thing. All of this stuff can be crammed into your data points to give through additional parameters, thereby giving you much more context. So you can filter, sort, and identify trends and identify meaningful distinctions about your audience. So you can make really informed decisions about how to improve that deployment or what you can learn from it, right? So all of that's involved. All right, so let's take a look at the data structure. So we'll go back to here. Now, remember this said 1,107 data points. Remember that, 1,107. We just generated more data points, right? So that number should go up. Let me refresh the page. Refresh. Ooh, we generated 20 data points according to this, huh? So far so good. Looks like we did generate some data. Let's take a look at it in Excel. Yep, there's the 20 data points, download data points. Of course, we want to open with Excel. And here it is. There it is. All right, so this is the raw data. Here we have, let me expand this a little bit, I guess. So here we have some of that automatically collected data. Remember I mentioned some data is always collected for every data point. Here's timestamps, local and universal, name of the device, was this composer or player, what version of composer or player, if it was player, did you have player tags, what's the operating system, OS version, experience name. You didn't have to tell us to collect it, we always collect it. Each row other than the first row is a data point, okay? So let me slide over a little bit. Here's the event name column. So this is the event names, experience started, scene entered, session started, scene left. Some of this is automatically generated. Remember, experience started, scene entered, scene left. All of these are automatic. We did session started. We did photo scene. So it's a combination of automatic events and our custom events. Notice when we leave a scene, we measure in elapsed time. That's your dwell time per scene. So apparently, this session lasted 58 seconds. We were on the guest book scene for 27 seconds, the photo scene for 30 seconds. That's helpful, right? When we created this session, here's the session ID. As I mentioned, this long hexadecimal number that exists to be random and thus never be like any other session. And then way over on the side are all the parameters we created. Now remember, you can have any number of parameters for data point. They can be different from one data point to the next. In this case, for photo scene, it had name and price. There's a sunshine in the field for 650. For guest books signed, we had email address and comment. There they are. So we didn't lie. The data's here, right? So that's what the raw data looks like. And you can start using this in Excel to build your own charts. You could, if you pre-configured a connector, use third-party platforms to analyze this data. What I'm going to show you now is our charts and dashboards feature. So under Manage, next to Analytics Data, is Analytics Dashboards. Everybody has access to Analytics Dashboards, and on Analytics Dashboards, everybody has access to this trade show dashboard. So what I'm showing you now, everybody has, okay? And this enables you to explore what we mean by charts and dashboards and give you a sense for the way it works. So this data was collected at a trade show by us last year. And we've created a whole bunch of charts. We've got bar charts and line charts. We've got single value charts. We've got a gauge chart. We've got a whole bunch of stuff here, stacked and pie. And so you can see all these different kinds of charts and different ways of exploring data. For example, I can filter. Check me out on the right here. So if I hover my mouse, I can select this and choose whether or not to show particular data. So these charts are interactive. Pretty cool. And we're going to come back to this in a moment. But you know, conceptually, a dashboard is a collection of charts. If I'm an agency or an integrator, I might want to create my own dashboard, one per client. And each client has a unique set of data and a unique set of charts. Let me create a new dashboard. Let's add a chart. So by adding a chart, I get a long list of templates. This is our chart template library. A lot of pre-configured charts that are built to look for typically all of the predefined fields that we collect, so we can make some educated guesses that some data will exist, and we can pre-build some of these visuals. Feel free to use some of these things. I'm going to create a new one just to show you chart creation. So notice there's a time scale here. Now that's predetermined at the dashboard level, but I can override it. So right now where I'm circling is looking at the past 30 days, which includes today. Okay. Here's on the left the data point parameters. So these are the parameters of data points collected in the last 30 days. There are two sections. There's sort of these automatically collected parameters, and then there's the custom parameters, which we've talked about. Automatic are collected for everybody, custom are because we define them. Okay? What I want to do is look at dwell time by scene. So let me take scene name, put it here on the dimension axis, which typically means the x-axis. So I'm saying I want the scene name on the x-axis, and I want elapsed time by scene on the y-axis. And take a look at that. We have ourselves a line chart. That's pretty simple, huh? So simply by dragging these two things, I have now created a chart. We can filter this. We can pre-filter and post-filter. There are no filters right now. If I take scene name and also drag it here into the filter section, the default is to show all scenes. I can say, nah, I only want to see this one. So let me click it. And notice how I'm only looking at one scene, so there's only one data point. You know, not very exciting. So you know what? Let's get rid of that filter. But you get the idea that by dragging in parameters into the filter section, I can pre-filter the data before it's charted. I can actually do this similar thing in chart control. So in this case, I'm putting scene name into the chart control section. In this case, the filter is in the chart. So I can choose whether or not in my dashboard if I want to filter the data. So the filters is a pre-filter, chart control is a post-filter. In either way, that lets me further constrain the data set to make sure I'm looking at exactly what I need to look at. At the top of the chart data section, I have multiple chart types. For example, maybe I think this will look better as a pie chart, so I can pick a pie chart. And that was pretty simple. You'll notice if I hover my mouse, it tells me data specific to that particular slice. In this case, the slice is a scene. So now I know the duration by scene. That's pretty cool. Notice at the bottom for data, if I turn on data, see that at the bottom? I now have a table associated with my chart. So I have lots of ways to configure this. I'll advise you to go online. There's lots of different chart options I can configure based on the chart type In this case, for the pie chart, there's just a couple. For line and bar, there could be a lot more. I can also personalize this, so we'll say dwell time by scene. Great, so now I've given a name to this chart. I can change the color scheme. So there's a lot of stuff you can do here. Let me save it. Save. And now it's in my dashboard. I actually have a lot of flexibility here, meaning I can resize it, and it will automatically compensate for that resize. Plus, I can move it around. So in this case, I don't have any other charts to worry about, so it's not very exciting. But this is me building my dashboard. Let me go back to the trade show dashboard. We got a lot more charts here. And notice in this case, I might decide that this, let's let it load up. We'll reconfigure now. So here, I might actually want to move these things around. So let me get my hand on this and then move this up over here and move this over here. I can make this a little bit bigger, okay? And then I want to tighten everything up. The little button that says optimize layout, so I tightened everything up. Okay? So the layout's up to me. There are ways to share charts. There are ways to share dashboards. If I want to share a chart, I hover my mouse over this little hamburger menu. See that? You see edit, duplicate, download, and delete. Duplicate means I want to share it. I can download as, these are different formats. Which I'm not seeing right now for some reason, but there's different image types you can also download as a CSV file. I know, obviously, again, I can duplicate it, meaning put a new instance of this chart with the same data, and I can go back to the chart editor. So I can take an individual chart and export it as an image or as a CSV file with the raw data. You might do that, but there's something you may really very well do, which is share the whole dashboard, right? And that's in the upper right-hand corner. So with this, I can share it. I can duplicate the whole dashboard if I want, but I'm going to duplicate, I'm going to share the dashboard. So I'm clicking that button. And here's what's happening here. Let me delete this because we'll create a new one. All right, so it's not shared yet. I'm creating a share. And when I create a share, it creates a URL and embeddable iframe code, which contains the same URL. The idea is if somebody enters this URL, they're going to see the dashboard. And it's a fully interactive dashboard. I showed you. You can click the key and filter and sort. And it's a real-time thing. And by the way, it's connected to the data hub. It's a live data feed, so you can do that too. This is live connections. I can create as many shares as I want. Notice I can have multiple shares. I can have multiple URLs, multiple embeddable iframes for the same data sheet, for the same dashboard. Why would I do that? Because I might have multiple audiences, but they don't all necessarily need to have access all the time. So I might share my dashboard with 3 parties, but after a period of time, I no longer need to share with party 3. So I delete their share, but I keep the other 2 live. Okay, so I can satisfy multiple clients, multiple internal bosses, and there are some display options. I can limit the data range. Do I want to show the name or the logo, or some ways to constrain and configure. Okay, so that's how I can share my dashboard, and it's a big deal because it's very likely, particularly for an agency or integrator, you're going to offer a key performance indicator service where you identify KPIs, build an experience that collects the relevant data, build the charts and dashboards with your client, share it with them, and then work with them to identify next steps for improving success of the deployment or learning something about their customers, about their target audience, and accommodating that accordingly. Pretty extensive, right? So that's the charts and dashboards feature. Very briefly, yes, you don't have to use our charts and dashboards feature if you have a third-party alternative. So for example, as I mentioned, you can do a data pull using REST web services. We can accommodate that. All you need to do is add your credential key for that project, and it's easy to get. You grab the credential key, and now you're pulling it in. There's Mixpanel, which we push data to it, and then conceptually, at the end of the day, it's very similar to Intuiface Analytics, where you can slice and dice and play with your data. Or Google Analytics. One cool thing Google Analytics does in particular is behavior flow. They call it behavior flow. It's if somebody starts on this scene, what do they go to next? And if they go to that next, what are they most likely to go to next? The common flows. And so it's a pretty cool thing that Google Analytics does automatically. You could do it with the raw data in Excel. It's just going to be more work. It's something Google is very good at because that's what they did for websites for 15 years. So all of that's possible from an export perspective. Let's talk about packaging and pricing, sort of wrap up this webinar together. Anybody can test analytics. I mentioned this before. With Composer in play mode, you can generate an unlimited number of data points. You can test it infinitely. If you want to use Player and you don't have a paid Composer analytics, you don't have a paid plan, an analytics plan, then players collectively can only generate up to 1,000 data points. Okay, so you're limited to the number of data points, just enough to try it out, but not to get to scale. You're also limited to one dashboard if you don't have an analytics plan. So you can create a dashboard, one dashboard, but that's it. There's only two other really plans to think about. If you want to use our charts and dashboards feature, there's only two plans to think about, basic and ultimate. Basic means up to 20 players. Ultimate means any number of players. That's the main difference. 20 players, unlimited players. They're both unlimited data points, both of them. 1,500 US, it's also 1,500 euros for the basic plan. For the ultimate plan, it's 5K. If you're an agency or an integrator, this is not per client. This is per you. So single plan, any number of clients. So the vast majority of you would have the ultimate plan because the ultimate plan is unlimited players. So it doesn't matter if you have one client or 1,000, you're just spending 5K annual to satisfy all of their analytics needs. So you spread that cost out across all your clients. It's peanuts. You'll notice it does say for ultimate there is some custom branding. So if you do use the basic plan, not only are you limited to 20 players, but it's going to say Intuiface on your dashboard. Okay, there's going to be a logo there. If you have the ultimate plan, you can put your own logo there. Okay, so the main difference is the number of players, but there is some custom branding. We did recognize that although most of you will use our charts and dashboards feature, some of you may not, the minority of you may not, which is why we created the data collection plan. That's 3K annual. The idea is you can collect an unlimited number of data points, but you won't be using our charts and dashboards feature. And in fact, you won't have access to it. But what you will be able to do is use all the connectors as much as you want. And that way for 3K, you can generate unlimited number of data points, unlimited number of players. You're just forwarding the data to something else. So hopefully this is pretty simple to understand. There's only really three choices for analytics. Let me wrap this up briefly, just talking about the kind of questions you can answer with analytics. For example, in retail, which stores have the most interactive signage use? Which product generated the most interest on a rainy day? What is the percentage of loyalty card holders who have browsed the kiosks? What is the gender split for kiosk users? This is interesting stuff. You could never do this with traditional signage because there's nothing you could directly measure to answer these questions. With interactive signage, you can. For sales presentations, I have a sales team on the road, right? It's not retail, but I know how often the pitch was delivered, how much time was spent delivering the pitch, which topics were most discussed with the prospect. Is there any feedback, like a guest bookie kind of thing, but for the sales rep? Maybe they're taking notes. Trade shows, you have a booth, and you're running an Intuiface experience. How many leads were collected during the first day? What were the most popular videos? What was the average idle time for various times of day? What share of sessions were run by staff versus self-service? One of the beauties of interactivity is they don't have to be manned, right? You don't need somebody standing there. You could have kiosks in your booth and people can visit and interact and you don't have to take care of them. But how are you going to measure that? How are you going to track that? And analytics makes that trivial. Exhibits like a museum. What were the most popular videos or topics? The average length of a session? How many members identified themselves? Did visitors have any feedback? You get it now, right? You see where this is going. Hospitality. What is the most popular menu item on a weekday, right? This could be a restaurant, could be a hotel. Which of the promoted restaurants is most often selected on a rainy day? That's pretty interesting. Which tourist destination gets the least number of queries? Whatever it is, get rid of it, right? Maybe you should put something up there. Which partner ads generated the most views and requests for an email? Yeah, you could do an AdWordy kind of thing, right? You could charge number of impressions, number of clicks. You could create a whole ad campaign where you're using Intuiface Analytics to count the number of times things were viewed through proof of play, and then even monetize that. So there's tons of things you can do to understand the Intuiface Analytics feature. If we jump out, let's take a look at our Help Center. So if we go to our Help Center, there's a whole chapter called Intuiface Analytics. It answers every single question you can think about. And in addition, a bunch of the sample experiences that we make available to you are already built to collect data. In fact, all of them are collecting scene entered, scene left, that sort of thing. But the ones you see on the screen here actually collect additional information as well, just to show you how the log event actions were configured, and even generating some data that you can then take a look at in charts and dashboards. Thank you for joining me on this whirlwind through Intuiface Analytics. I hope you found this interesting, educational, motivating, and I hope you understand the potential of analytics to help you make really informed business decisions, to give you the insight you need to determine how to maximize the effectiveness of your Intuiface deployments, and to learn deep, deep things about your target audience to help you address them better in the future. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. I appreciate your time and attention.